long that will take. They'll be easier to read than the last exhibits that we did doing guilt innocence, but they are 4 different reports and all. And then we plan to close at that point. And I just know that you're probably thinking, and I know the state's probably thinking about scheduling aspects.
All right. And let me, do we have an idea yet of whether there'll be rebuttal evidence?
Your Honor, there won't be rebuttal evidence.
Okay.
From the state, no.
All right. So I suspect, well, I don't know whether they'll have time to review the all of the materials that you're seeking to publish following cross-examination today. I would expect that, as I look at it, it's probably at least 100 pages. The 4 exhibits total, probably in excess of 100 pages. All right. That's fine. We can work with that schedule. I do need to bring one matter to your attention. Juror number 9, I believe, reported to the bailiff that as he was riding the elevator, a man who was on the elevator, he got on the elevator on the 3rd floor. He left the elevator on the 5th floor. The juror did not recognize him from being in this courtroom at all. Asked him, "Are you on recess?" The juror said yes. The individual said, "You've been here long?" The juror said, "A bit." And the individual said, "Hope you get out soon." And the juror reports his jury tag was on full display. Do we need to inquire further on this, or does anybody wish to be heard on this?
I think, yeah, that's Mr. Fulks. And I think he's reported before when we had the Nicholas incident. He seems to be a great rule follower, has reported it in the past. Mm-hmm. If the last interaction had no effect on him, I can't imagine this one would. You know, if the defense would like for you to, that's fine, but I don't think you need to inquire, Your Honor.
If that's what happened, it sounds like what happened. It doesn't sound like it's anything.
Right.
It doesn't sound like it involves anybody that's going to.
Right. That's my sense as well. That this is certainly appreciate his reporting of it, and but we'll just simply leave it at that and not make any further inquiry. So let's go ahead and bring jurors out, please. Let me ask, for the exhibits that you're publishing, you have copies sufficient for 14 jurors?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I believe we turn now to cross-examination of this witness. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Blackshear. How are you?
Doing good.
Good. I need to speak with you about the evaluation you did in this case and how you came to the opinion that you did. Your opinion is you diagnosed the defendant with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay. And who contacted you to conduct this examination?
Jonathan Brown.
And I think you say in your report that the purpose of the report, or that the defendant was referred for clinical evaluation during his pretrial incarceration to determine if there are any psychological factors from his history that may have relevance to this case.
Yeah,
That was what you were hired to do.
correct.
And did they provide the records for your consideration?
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. There we
That's
go.
fine.
All right, good.
And I think Ms. Hamburger went over those with you, and they're listed on the front of your psychological
Yeah.
assessment report. Is that right?
Correct, yeah.
And that would include Wake County Public School records, dynamic office, work history, Alfred Williams work history, Wake County Human Service records, emergency service medical records, and so on and so forth. But those were all presented to you by the defense. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you request, or did they provide any records, or did the state provide any records to you for your consideration?
No, the state did not.
All right. And do you know when the state received your report?
I do not.
Okay.
Yeah.
But when was this report created?
So originally, I started working on the report, say, goodness. Let me go back to my earlier dates. So the actual date of like sort of starting to write up a report would have been, I want to say probably last summer, and continued to work on it as I got more information about the case.
Okay. So when did you provide the final report to the defense?
That would have been, I think it was December or January.
Okay. Would have been January 2nd of, it says 2016, but was it January 2nd of 2017?
Yeah.
Okay. So January of this year. And you met with the defendant, you say, on 6 occasions, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. The first time being a little over a year after the incident on April, or the crimes that he's been convicted of, April 30th. It says 3015, but it's 2015, correct?
Mm-hmm. So I have 2015 here on mine. Oh, yes. Ooh, I do see that 30, yeah.
All right. And then again in May of 2015,
Uh-huh.
twice, March of 2016, May of 2016, and then December of 2016.
Right, and I saw him once more in January. But that was after the report was submitted.
I see. All right. Did you actually request any records from the state, or were all of the documents provided to you by the defense?
The documents were provided to me by the defense.
And you don't kind of conduct your own independent investigation. You're a forensic psychologist, so you take the information that's given to you and try and make the best judgment that you can.
Yes, and I always, the more the merrier, so I was really glad to be able to get a lot of these historical records, so, yeah.
Sure. And did you review all of those records in coming to your conclusions?
Yes, I read all of these records.
And you also, in your meetings with the defendant, made notes about his version of events and his history. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you use that as well as a basis for your opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you said at your first meeting you went to establish rapport. Did you introduce yourself to I guess now the convicted person, and say that you were there at the request of the defense, or did you tell him who you were?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And did you think that he understood what you were there to do?
No. As is the case sometimes, but not all the time. But in this, along with the assistance, I think there was some apprehension about talking to a psychologist and what that would mean.
Okay. But you explained to him what you were there to do, who had sent you, his lawyer.
Yeah.
Did you explain to him that this was going to be in preparation for trial and that you might possibly testify?
Yes.
And you say, I believe in the beginning of your report, that over the course of several meetings, he was fully oriented and aware. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that he rarely became animated, but did on occasion become quite verbose when discussing the relationship history with his wife, LaTanya Taylor, now Allen.
Yes.
Okay. And you also noted in your report that he was polite, remained highly engaged throughout each evaluation session, and it was easy to establish a rapport with him. And during each session, he elaborated on his familial, marital, and paternal histories. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And again, that was after you explained your role in this process. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
And you, I guess, read summaries of interviews with several people who've testified, like Katina Rainey, Jamal Carroll, Nathan Carroll.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Antoinette Holden, Bertha Postley. Is that right?
Correct.
And they're all related to the defendant.
They are. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, you came to a conclusion of post-traumatic stress disorder, and you mentioned the DSM-5. Is that right?
Right.
And I think you told Ms. Hamburger that that's sort of the clinician's Bible. Is that correct?
Right.
And that you use the PTSD to essentially help you in coming to conclusions or making diagnostic assessments of someone's, various mental disorders. Is that right?
Yeah, and sort of being able to speak to, what would have triggered someone who had not had a history of being homicidally dangerous to other people, all of a sudden become so. Yeah.
And right before lunch, you gave your opinion that it was PTSD, and you asked what caused that post-traumatic stress disorder. I believe you said that the traumas included his life growing up in a domestic violence home. Is that right?
Yes.
Parental dysfunction and instability within that home.
Mm-hmm.
His mother's lack of adaptive functioning, her alcohol use disorder, and her crack cocaine addiction, his family breaking up and the disillusion of that relationship. Let's see. And then maybe in community violence and the trauma that people encountered as a result of where they lived, and that would be the robberies and the beatings.
Sure.
Okay. And so those are what you find to be the traumatic events that have led to his the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. Now, in the DSM-5, it says that the essential feature of post-traumatic stress disorder is the development of characteristic symptoms following exposure to one or more traumatic events. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you were asked about, I guess, the checklist that you need to go through in finding post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'd like to go through that with you in a little bit more detail.
Okay.
And they are numbered A through H. So with A, I believe you said that he met the criteria of directly experiencing the traumatic event. Would that be the robbery or home invasion?
Correct. And then witnessing in person.
Right. And witnessing in person is kind of number 2, subheading A. Events that occurred to others. And so would that be the domestic violence he saw in the home?
Correct.
And then you might have even said 3, learning the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or a close friend.
Correct.
And so that would be in cases of maybe where he didn't actually observe the violence between his father and his mother?
But he saw the outcome.
Or he saw the outcome, okay. He doesn't have number 4, that's experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to adverse details of the traumatic event, is that right?
Yes.
You didn't find that. It actually says, e.g., first responders collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse as examples of that.
Correct.
Okay. And so you found 3 segments under A. For B, you said recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive, distressing memories of the traumatic event.
Right.
Okay. And from where in any of the materials did you find evidence of that?
From my conversations with him. So he was able to detail that these things had happened, but I didn't see, there weren't any, unfortunately, in any intervention records, like a medical record or a treatment record, where you would have had somebody saying, hey, this kid's wetting the bed, or this kid is having sleep problems or sleepwalking. I mean, that's common in children who have these. You know, if I would have been able to interview family, I would have asked those questions. And go ahead.
Well, but I mean, you had statements from his mother and his sister and his father that he lived with. Did you see anywhere in their statements where he was wetting the bed or having bad dreams or any of the things that would cause you to believe that he was having recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive, distressing memories?
Unfortunately, they weren't asked. I would have asked directly about those. But what they were asked had nothing to do with what I was assessing at that time. So they didn't answer they didn't answer those questions.
So you found number 1 based on the self-reporting of the defendant?
Correct.
You found number 2, the recurrent distressing dreams in which the content and or effect of the dream are related to the traumatic event. Now, did the defendant report that
No,
to you?
I did not find number 2. I found number 3.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, and number 3 is a dissociative reaction, a flashback, in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic event were recurring. And from what in the record did you find that?
Not in the record, from my conversations with him. Correct.
Again, from your conversations with him? And so he self-reported again to you that he had flashbacks?
No, dissociative qualities. Like when the trauma was occurring, when I was talking earlier, when a person dissociates, it's a pretty typical kind of response that people have when they're engaged in with the trauma, especially if they have a history of traumatic events.
Okay, and so just to be clear, did he give examples of times when he exhibited dissociative qualities?
When he was shooting his in-laws and his wife.
But again, that's based on his self-report.
Correct.
You found number 4, is that right? Or number 5?
Neither 4 nor 5.
Okay.
Correct.
And again, so this is B, presence of one or more of the following intrusion systems. And so you found 1, recurrent, involuntary, intrusive, distressing memories of the traumatic event, and dissociative reactions, both based on his self-reporting, correct?
Yes.
Now, I don't recall you being asked or saying anything about C, but C is the persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic event beginning after the traumatic event occurred. Did you find either of those?
Well, avoidance of distressing memories, thoughts, and or feelings about traumatic events. And given the gravity of his historical trauma, and given the accounts in the record from interviewees about how he always remained sort of this calm, docile kid in the face of those things, and when we would talk about that traumatic history, his response of minimalizing it to me represents an effort to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings closely related to the trauma, because I didn't see that kid that was described earlier who was trying to break the parents up from beating each other. He wouldn't tap into that affect when he would tell me about it. It would be matter of fact, but low affect.
Okay, and so, again, you took his minimization, as you called it, as evidence of that. Is that correct?
Right, and when I tried to recall those events to elicit an affective attachment to them, I did not get those. I mean, it was very, very clearly an effort to minimize how serious it was, minimize how significant it was, but it's not. That's just really not uncommon.
Or avoidance or efforts to avoidance of or efforts to avoid external reminders, people, places, conversations, activities, objects, and situations. Now,
yeah, not those.
Okay, so you did not find number
No.
two.
He was highly engaged with the external reminders, his family.
Right. He maintained a relationship with his father that he described
Yeah.
as good in adulthood, correct?
Mm-hmm.
All right, and he's had strong family support here throughout the trial, or at least that you've noticed
That I've
since you've
noticed.
been here.
Yeah.
Sure. And then we move to D, which is negative alterations in cognitions and mood associated with traumatic events.
Right.
And they have to begin or worsen after the traumatic events occurred, as evidenced by two or more of the following. Now, the first is inability to remember important aspects of the traumatic event. Did you find that one?
No, he was able to recall that the traumatic events happened, although I didn't get a lot of good detail about, I would have, loved to have gotten the sort of movie version of it, but unfortunately when children experience these chronic traumas, they don't remember it as these sort of separate narratives. They're remembered in snapshots. And so that's how he winds up recalling it for me. But when asked, did these things happen, he could recall that they did.
Okay. And when you say these things, is that the family violence between his mother and father, her alcohol and crack addiction, things of that nature?
Yeah, those things.
Was he able to better remember the details of the beatings, the robbery and the beating with a baseball bat or something of that nature?
No. I recalled them with the same level of low affect and moderate detail.
What about persistent negative beliefs about self?
Not so much about self, but definitely about others.
Right, particularly Sylvester Taylor?
Yes.
So you do find, I guess,
For that one, yeah.
so I guess that would be number two.
Yeah.
So you found number two.
Yeah, so that's D2. And then D3.
Persistent distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences of the traumatic events that lead him to blame himself and or others. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Mm-hmm.
And would that involve the type of statement he made, like they got what they deserved, or if LaTanya had just talked to me, none of this would have happened?
Correct.
Persistent negative emotional state. Did you find that?
The guilt and the shame, I for me, was something that became more evident over time when we were able to sort of have a more open conversation about the consequences of having shot his in-laws and his wife, and what that would, the impact of that on his children even, and even talking about the impact of what bringing those details to the public domain and having his children be a part of that. So, yes.
And could it be hard, could it be difficult to kind of ferret out whether his persistent negative emotional state was coming from his feelings of guilt or his current situation being incarcerated?
I would say that it wasn't ever about, I feel bad that I'm here in jail. It was much more about, I don't want to have my kids confront all of this.
He didn't want his kids to confront all of this?
He didn't want to have his kids have to, be part of the bringing the details of the case to the public domain, correct?
The more information you have, the better, correct?
Always.
Sure. So would it change your opinion about that aspect if...
Objection. I'm just maybe anticipating what Mr. Lavery's question is going to be. But I think it's
Let's hear the question, and then I'll consider the objection.
that the defendant had attempted and had contacted his son in an effort to talk to him about his testimony.
Go ahead, you may answer.
No, because I don't know what the goal of that was, and I didn't even know that happened. Yeah.
Okay. Right. You did not know that happened, so you couldn't have used it in your determination. Now, 5 is diminished interest in significant activities. Were you able to find that?
No, we didn't do that.
Okay. Or 6, markedly diminished interest, or I'm sorry, feelings of detachment or estrangement from others.
No. Mm-mm.
Or 7, persistent inability to experience positive emotions.
Right, no.
No. Okay, so under D, we've got 4 and 3, and you needed 2 there, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Under E, marked alterations in arousal and reactivity associated with the traumatic events, beginning or worsening after the traumatic event occurred, and evidenced by 2 or more of the following. Now, 1, did you find 1, which is irritable behavior and angry outbursts with little or no provocation, typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression towards people or objects?
Yes.
Okay. And where did you find that irritable behavior and angry outbursts?
When he shot his in-laws and his wife and beat her.
All right. And then you said you found reckless and self-destructive behavior
Right.
just in his use of alcohol and marijuana.
Correct, as well as the harmful behavior that happened to that he had when he harmed his in-laws. Also, it's reckless and self-destructive to want to see his wife and connect with her so much that he defied the order that was in place that he not. So yeah.
But not just any, I mean, you wouldn't find that anyone that consumes some alcohol or even consumes some marijuana was necessarily self-destructive, would you?
No. That's why these other factors are part of that. It wouldn't be if he just drank alcohol and smoked weed. No.
All right. But he didn't report to you that he had a particular problem with it or was doing it for any other reason than to do it socially. Is that right?
Yeah, he indicated that he would drink alcohol and smoke marijuana to chill and to relax and in social situations.
And in terms of the sale of marijuana, I mean, did he talk about that in terms of supporting his family?
The sale of marijuana was, I sort of couched it in terms of, you have a, you have high school education, and you have limited skill set. You begin to put those to use, but you have high responsibility. And you wound up being selling marijuana, but I had never had the indication that this was a highly lucrative and successful enterprise.
Just no indication from the reports that you were receiving.
Mm-hmm.
You found hypervigilance in number 3, is that correct?
Yes.
And what's your example of that?
And persistently finding Mr. Taylor, Sylvester Taylor, as a threatening stimuli in his life. I mean, he dated it all the way back to the late 1990s when he indicated that Mr. Taylor had threatened him even back then, and that persisted throughout their relationship.
All right, but, I mean, I understand hypervigilance to mean taking actions sort of above and beyond what's reasonable to protect oneself. So what's the example?
So hypervigilance really is being sort of super aware and being very, very guarded. And most people, let's give you the sort of stereotypical example, be a veteran going out, a PTSD veteran going out to a restaurant. They will often tell you they sit with their backs to the door and they watch the door just in case anything happens. So when people are hypervigilant, they really anticipate and expect something negative going to happen when confronted with the object of that vigilance, and that's what he was. The way he described his relationship, that relationship had tension, it had conflict in it, and he also feared that relationship would cause him or his son, after a period of time, harm.
You did not find exaggerated startle response, which is number 4, correct?
No.
Or problems with concentration, number 5?
No.
Or sleep disturbance?
No.
Now, F is that the duration of the disturbance is more than 1 month under criteria B, C, D, and E. What is the time period that you find that he was suffering under post-traumatic stress disorder and under these symptoms?
Based on my communication with him and the assessment that I was able to gather, likely had been for a very long time, definitely up around the time that the incident occurred. And we know that PTSD does not, when you go through the traumas and you develop this disorder, it's not like having depression, right? When you're just sort of down and can't get out of bed or feeling bad for a period of time. This is a much more stable and a disorder that one has to probably learn how to manage more so than they actually can get rid of. So based on everything that I could tell, my diagnosis of him was that at the time that I had evaluated him, he had been suffering from PTSD at least back to the time of the incident.
2009?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, is that when the incident occurred? 2009?
I think May of 2009. Does the DSM-5 say that half the people who are confronted with PTSD or who are symptomatic of it have a complete recovery within 3 months?
For single incident events, yes.
Okay, single incident events, and let's talk about what those are. There is a list of events and diagnostic features.
Yeah.
The first is exposure to war as a combatant or civilian. You obviously didn't find that.
Right.
Threatened or actual physical assaults, number 2. You would have found that.
Yeah.
Is that correct? But not threatened or actual sexual abuse?
There were indicators in his record about that, but nothing that I could confirm, and nothing that he would acknowledge.
Okay. If they were, but it was not a basis of your opinion.
Correct.
It was not one of the events. Sexual violence, kidnapping, being taken hostage or terrorist attack,
Right.
torture, incarceration as a POW, natural or human-made disasters, severe motor vehicle accidents. Of course, none of those. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Observing threatened or serious injury, would that have been
That's
one of your
one, yeah.
findings?
Mhm.
Observing natural death, no. And then observing assault with physical or sexual abuse and domestic violence. I assume that you made
Yes.
those as potential findings.
Right.
Medical catastrophe in one's child, you did not find that,
No.
did you?
No.
Or accident or war or disaster.
Correct.
Okay. And again, one of the keys to PSD is the development of characteristic symptoms following exposure to one or more traumatic events, correct?
Yes, but we also know that onset is very different, and symptomatic display does not show up the same for everyone.
Well, it typically shows within several months, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, yes, but it may show up in many, many different ways. I mean, it can show up in, a kid having ulcer-like symptoms. It can show up again in many of these ways that, had I met him back when he was a child or an adolescent, I probably would be able to give you sort of how these things are sort of showing up. So meeting with him at the time that I did, I had to sort of take what I could gather from, my conversations with him as well as a review of the records. But the notion that everyone with PTSD is having nightmares, hallucinating, having flashbacks, that is not the case. And many, many people will not display symptoms until we call delayed onset of symptoms. They won't experience symptoms too much after the event.
Okay, so your basis of saying that he's got post-traumatic stress disorder largely revolves around things that happened in his childhood. Is that correct?
And the incident.
The 2009 incident.
Correct.
But during the course of his childhood and into young adulthood, and up until he was 31 years old, there's no evidence that he had a violent outburst or committed a dangerous assault on anyone else. Is that right? From the records you've received.
Prior to this incident, you mean?
Right, prior to the murders of Sylvester Taylor and Anglia Taylor.
Right.
And the attempted murder of LaTanya Allen.
Correct.
Well, let's talk after diagnostic features about associated features supporting the diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there are things like developmental regression, auditory pseudo-hallucinations, difficulties regulating emotions and maintaining stable interpersonal relationships, or dissociative symptoms. Is that right?
Yes.
And other than the night of the murder, based on the defendant's reporting to you, there's nothing in the record where you find dissociative symptoms. Is that correct?
Not dissociative, but the others that you mentioned, emotional dysregulation, as well as there was one other you mentioned between that and dissociative.
Was it the pseudo-hallucinations?
No, not that.
Regulating emotions and maintaining stable interpersonal relationships?
Right, and the instability of interpersonal relationships.
Well, let's talk about that. You were asked about the support he had at the time of the separation.
Mm-hmm.
He had his son, Jeremy. Is that correct?
He did.
And I believe he testified and he was living with Jamal, his half-brother, correct?
And my recollection is that he was living with his father at some point during that time.
Okay. Well, he had his father, and you weren't here for the testimony, but I believe you interviewed Jamal. Would it surprise you that he actually was living with Jamal and had his support during the time of the separation?
No, I mean, I'm sure he was probably moving between relatives, trying to sort out what's going to become his permanent living.
And he had Douglas Carroll, who has been here throughout most of the trial. Is that right?
Correct.
And Katina Rainey and the other members of his large family. So he did have support. Is that right?
He has a lot of family, and they're here. And I think one of the things, just from my observation today, was that you could also see the pain that this domestic violence relationship has caused across this family. So it's, yes, they are here. They are here in support of him. But that does not mean that this family has not been negatively impacted and permanently changed because of what was delivered into it.
But it also doesn't mean that he was unable to maintain stable interpersonal relationships, does it?
And so when we talk about, the instability of his interpersonal relationships, especially with the reported history between him and his wife of the earlier on during the dating years, a lot of break up and back together, that was probably largely due to, his difficulty. I mean, he's a kid trying to figure out how to be a man at 14, 15, and all of a sudden parenthood is there at 16, I believe, and trying to do all of these things. And I think it's pretty clear that, this relationship eventually wind up dissolving, and we see this a lot in PTSD folks of divorce and marital dissolution.
But he was married for 13 years.
Correct, yeah.
And by all accounts from the folks who have testified, for a long time it seemed like it was a good marriage.
I'm not sure, yeah. But by his account, and the marriage did have its problems throughout.
And that was, again, him self-reporting to you after you'd been hired to meet with him about this trial, correct?
Correct.
In terms of prevalence, it appears that, and again, I'm going right through
Yeah.
the DSM-5. It looks like PTSD rates are higher among veterans and others whose vocation increases the risk of traumatic exposure, like police, firefighters, or emergency personnel.
Mm-hmm.
And then that highest rates, from 1/3 to more than 1/2 of those exposed, are found among survivors of rape, military combat, captivity, and ethnically or politically motivated internment and genocide. Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Development in course, and that's where we talked about, duration of symptoms also varies, with complete recovery within 3 months occurring in approximately 1/2 of adults, while sometimes individuals remain symptomatic for longer than 12 months and sometimes more than 50 years. Does that sound like an accurate statement?
Yeah, they do.
DSM-5. All right. Now you've identified a couple of types of trauma or traumatic events. And you've talked about complex trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And you say that complex trauma will be in the next edition of the DSM-5.
Well, I'm not sure. That's something that I know that the researchers of what happens to people who have experienced chronic multiple traumas are working to do. Because I know that, the way that the wording is, and it doesn't explicitly state anything about this concept of complex trauma, which is, it's just a new concept to talk about things we've always been talking about.
But it is not a part of the canon or the Bible of the DSM-5 as it's currently written. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. And again, this is what you look to in identifying certain disorders. So, again, wouldn't it be better to limit yourself to the traumatic events that are included and that you found?
I did, yeah.
Okay. Now, in terms of risk and prognostic factors, again, from your records, you don't have any evidence of childhood emotional problem or mental disorders in the defendant.
No, not in him.
And genetically, the DSM reports that a risk factor includes the female gender and younger age at the time of the trauma exposure for adults. Sure. That the DSM says Genetic and physiological risk factors include female gender and younger age at the time of the trauma exposure for adults. Okay. Here's what I want to talk to you about next. Would you typically find that someone who is suffering from PTSD, when they had a violent outburst or a dissociative event, would that be in response to some triggering event?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, and again, you stated all your bases. This home invasion in 2009, and the complex things that aren't in the DSM-5, but maybe in the DSM-6. None of those were present on April 9th of 2014, were they?
What was present on April, it was 9th, is that right? Was a man who was suffering from PTSD, who was losing his family and had been desperately trying to connect back with his wife, and by right she tried to put into place a boundary between the two of them. And the reason why we put those things into place is to protect people. And when his coping with the loss of her and the loss of his identity is attached to being a married man to her and her family, you had what happens for a lot of people with PTSD who run out of a capacity to cope with what their life circumstance at that moment, and you had someone who committed an act of harm against someone else.
Let me put it to you this way, and this example is in the book.
Yeah.
They maybe experiencing a natural disaster would cause PTSD in a person, right? Like
Yes.
being in a tornado.
Sure.
Okay, and the flashback happens when the wind picks up outside.
Correct.
Or the startle response in a former veteran of a foreign war occurs when they hear a car backfire.
Right.
And that takes them to that traumatic place.
Right.
Okay. On April 9th of 2014, is there any evidence self-reported by the defendant or in the record that he was going to be the victim of a home invasion?
No, I don't even understand how that's connected, but no.
Well, you've listed it as one of the triggering events, or one of the basis of your finding of post-traumatic stress disorder.
I listed it as a trauma that had resulted in PTSD, but not as a trigger on that day. Now I can tell you sort of, I see where you're headed with it. I'll give a counter example. So I did an evaluation for a veteran who had been at war in November, and last Monday he parked his car outside of the VA in Durham, and he shot himself in the head because he could no longer cope with being alive, right, in his current condition. Now, there weren't any guns going off around him that made him shoot himself in the head. There weren't any bombs exploding out in the parking lot of the VA. But he did something that was self-destructive in that moment. And so that's what that day was like, right, where Nathan was not triggered by something that sort of reflected his trauma, right? He didn't hear a woman being beaten out in the street and then ran over and shot and killed his in-laws. Nate was triggered by the loss of his family, and he could not cope with that.
But the loss of your family is not one of the things listed as a traumatic event that would cause post-traumatic stress disorder.
Loss as no, because his PTSD, you're right, his PTSD was not caused by the loss of his family. The loss of his family caused him to act out in a way that was just violently destructive to everything that he loved, but the PTSD was already developed.
Okay. Now, you say that he exhibited symptoms of dissociation on that evening. Is that right?
By his report, yes.
You're right. Again, by his self-reporting. Did he give you a statement about what happened, both in his marriage and on the evening of April the 9th?
Yes, he gave me that his marriage was dissolving. They had been apart, I think, for a couple months at the time. Maybe. Can't remember exactly how long they were apart. And he told me as best he could recall the events of that evening.
Okay. Do you have your notes of your meeting with Nathan Holden and in front of you? Can you pull them up?
I don't know if I have them with me. Let's see.
Map.
Yes, sir.
I've got what I've marked states exhibit S. I'd ask to approach.
Yes.
Oh, you got it.
All
right.
I recently received these. Will you take a look at them and see if those are notes that you had of your meeting with,
Meetings with him, yes.
with the conviction? I believe it's 2 pages there, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Give me just a sec. Now, do they appear to be altered in any way, or do they actually reflect what he reported to you?
Just reflect what, yes. I mean, when I take notes, I take them to help me recall the conversation, and these are the notes that I took.
So in looking at those notes, that's refreshed your recollection, and you think you could testify about it?
Yeah.
And he reported to you they'd been together 20 years,
Yes.
and that he couldn't wait to talk to LaTanya. Now, when is this being reported to you?
And this is early on, and so if you think of this as a chronology, the earlier conversations are this material. So yes, couldn't wait to talk to her, and that he, wanted to, he told his father that he wanted to talk to LaTanya, but and early on he sort of had this sense that if he and LaTanya could have a talk.
Well, I was just asking if this
I
was
apologize.
when this was happening.
Yeah, earlier. Go ahead.
Okay. And he reported to you that his wife had had affairs, and he had forgiven her numerous times. Is that right?
He did.
And they'd break up often, but always reconcile.
He did.
And did he admit to you that he had affairs as well, but was never caught?
Yes. Well, never caught. He would say, so when I would ask, because your wife had an affair, or she had several affairs, y'all got back together. And so my next obvious round of question would be, did you ever have any affairs? And he was like, well, yeah, I talked to people, I saw people, yes.
Okay. But, I mean, you wrote this.
Yeah.
Both had affairs, he was never caught. Okay.
Sure.
And he admitted that he didn't get along with his FIL, I guess that's
His father-in-law, yeah.
Okay. And was afraid of him, and everyone was afraid of him,
Yeah.
and he had pulled a gun on him.
Mm-hmm. On his first anniversary, he said. It was the second time.
First anniversary?
That there was one in 1989 and then pulled a gun on him. Nate said that his father-in-law pulled a gun on him on their first anniversary.
And he said that family was chaotic growing up, father abusive, mother a drug addict and mental problems, but then now he spent time with his adult as a father and was in a much better relationship with them. Is that right?
And that's my notes of what he's telling me. These
Right.
are not verbatim, correct?
Correct. And then he told you that he drank 2 or 3 six-packs with friends on the day of the murders. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And smoked marijuana. Now, did he report to you that dude or father-in-law came running at him with a flashlight?
Right.
Okay. and that was the first time the defendant had seen him after he pulled a gun on his son.
Correct.
Now, you don't have the police report or the benefit of the testimony that a gun had never actually been pulled on his son. Is that correct?
I did see the DSS records regarding that incident, but no, I had not. It was my understanding that a gun or some type of weapon had been pulled on his son.
All right, but you hadn't seen the police report where no gun was mentioned, or the testimony of JT where he said that his grandfather had not pulled a gun on him.
No, I didn't. No.
And then he reports to you that his son was upset, so they went by the church, and LaTanya was not sick at the church.
So she was sick and was not at the church when
Right.
they went there.
And that he wanted to make sure she was okay, so they went to the in-laws home. That's what he reported to you.
Yeah, he wanted to check on her.
And again, you didn't have the benefit of the testimony or all the information, but might it have changed your opinion that it was actually the defendant's idea to go to the church and then go to the house, and that JT hadn't asked to do either of those things?
Oh, I'm not surprised by that.
Okay. And he tells you that Sylvester Taylor charged towards him and that he started shooting, and that he thought his mother-in-law was his father-in-law and accidentally shot her.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you didn't have the benefit of the evidence from the City County Bureau of Identification or the State Bureau of Investigation or the State Crime Lab, did you?
No, I did not see that.
And or the medical examiner. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so would it have changed your opinion at all to know that Anglia Taylor was shot and found dead in her bedroom, and that Sylvester Taylor was shot 4 times with one shell casing being in the kitchen, another shell casing being several yards out behind the house where his body was found?
No, that wouldn't surprise me.
And then he reported to you that he got into a pushing fight with his wife and shot her accidentally. Is that correct?
That's what he indicated.
That's
yeah.
what he reported to you, and pistol whipped her.
Right.
And that he didn't know she was shot until he fell back on the
Until
bed.
she fell back on the bed. Yeah.
And again, you didn't have the benefit of all of the police reports or testimony, but would it surprise you to find that he had actually shot her twice and that had attempted to shoot her a third time, but that third cartridge misfed or jammed?
No, that wouldn't surprise me at all, unfortunately.
But again, he said that he shot her accidentally, correct?
Yes, that was what he reported to me.
And that he said, and you also didn't have the reports from the ballistics person from the State Crime Lab that talked about the amount of pressure that would have to be applied to a trigger, and that all the safety features were working on it.
Correct.
You didn't have that, did you?
Right.
Okay. And that he said, and this looks like it is a quotation, if I had planned to do something, my kids would not have been there, and this might be a typo, and my mother-in-law, it says,
Would not have been.
Would
Yeah.
not have been.
Right.
He didn't mention LaTanya or Sylvester, however.
No.
And none of his children were shot, is that right?
Correct.
Okay, or harmed physically, is that right?
Not physically.
Right. And after the shooting, the defendant, he says, called the police and left his ID for his son.
Mm-hmm.
And he tells you he considered killing himself after the shooting, but was arrested in the woods near his home.
Yeah.
Right. And that he left the scene to get rid of the marijuana and gun.
Mm-hmm. Irrational.
Okay. And when he heard the police approaching, he knelt and prayed.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't report to you that he fired first at the police officers.
He did.
And that he's upset he's not able to speak to his children.
Mm-hmm.
And he reported to you no history of mental health treatment, correct?
Right. Yeah.
And he denied feeling depressed at the time of the shooting.
Mm-hmm.
And that he felt like he was moving on with his life.
Correct.
And he took Jeremy and the gun over to the Taylor residence on Lake Glad Road. Is that right?
Yes.
One of the other things you have to do, I guess, when you're doing a diagnosis is make sure that it's this and not something else. So did you consider adjustment disorders
No.
or other post-traumatic disorders like acute stress disorder?
Oh, well, yeah, of course. I mean, I know he was under acute stress, but what makes this not that is the long-standing history of trauma exposure.
Or what about anxiety disorders or obsessive-compulsive disorders?
Yeah, I've diagnosed these and used them a ton, and he did not meet criteria for those.
Or major depressive disorder?
I do believe that he was likely experiencing depression, and depression is highly comorbid with post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning that people who are struggling, with depression and with PTSD will likely, signal depression as one of their symptoms. But major depressive disorder was not enough to sort of encapsulate his entire clinical picture.
Well, and he didn't claim to be depressed, did he?
No, he didn't claim to be, but I mean, a lot of people don't claim to be what I wound up diagnosing them because they don't know how to they can't self-diagnose.
But there's also nothing in the record from his friends and family about his nature and the way he behaved that would indicate it. Is there?
Yeah, and they're not clinicians either, so I wouldn't anticipate that they would be able to offer me clinically relevant information about that.
And you ruled out any psychotic disorder, is that right?
Yes.
And traumatic brain injury.
Right.
You did rule that out.
Correct. Okay. Even though I believe he had brain trauma, but I didn't assess for a TBI because there were no markers that indicated that he had any lingering impact from the bat to the head.
In a case of PTSD where you have to rely to an extent on the defendant self-reporting to you, do you ever concern yourself with their truthfulness to you?
Yeah, that's why I like to refer to sort of collaborative information. There's not like an assessment that I could give you, and if you check the box like the Beck Depression Inventory or the Milan Clinical Multi-Axis Inventory or the MMPI, that would, sort of be a measure that somebody can go check some boxes and I can say, oh, how you got PTSD. I mean, this comes from being, heavily trained and a ton of experience to be able to, use your clinical expertise to make that kind of a diagnosis.
Well, and looking in your clinical experience and your research experience and publications and professional presentations, I see about 19 publications and professional presentations. Does that sound about right?
Sure, yeah.
But I don't see PTSD as a discipline or diagnosing PTSD listed in any of those.
No, what you'll see in my presentation history is, things probably much more related to my work on anger and aggression and violence, which is largely related to PTSD. But I'm not I spend so much time doing the work, and I spend a whole lot of time being a dean at the university till I don't do a whole lot of going out and presenting, but I do go to a lot of trainings, and I do get a lot of clinical hours of training because I always want to stay sharp and stay up on the latest, clinical, standard practices with regards to making diagnosis and treatment. So, yeah, I'm not, on the circuit out giving talks and things like that.
And you say anger, aggression, and violence are heavily related to PTSD, right?
Hmm.
That's a symptom you see?
No, but you can often see that show up in anger outbursts, or it's not like the thing, like, oh, if you got anger and violence, aha, that's it. But it's a much more complicated diagnostic syndrome than that. But my history, I'm on the behavior assessment team at the university because, I have a lot of training on being able to watch and take in data with regards to how somebody's behaving or engaging so that we can actually intervene in a way to keep the community safe. So then that's just one sort of thing. So it's the fact that I don't do a lot of presentations doesn't mean that I'm not on the scene to actually get the information from the researchers who are doing that work.
Do you find PTSD useful in explaining violence?
No, not necessarily.
You say you've testified 5 or 6 times before,
Mhm.
and you testified in state of North Carolina versus Dennis Roy. Is that correct?
Yes. Let me do this right.
Back in 2012.
Yeah.
And do you recall concluding that the defendant exploded under the pressure of stress resulting in the murder of Mr. Bruno?
Yes. In that case, had a lot of interesting factors that I can open up for you so you can understand my clinical picture there if you wish.
Well, no, I think we just need to understand this case, but I just wanted to see if you had found it in that case as well.
Found what?
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
And that was the diagnostic picture in that case?
I'm asking that.
I need to see that, if you don't mind, because I can't remember that. It was a long
Okay,
time
if you
ago.
can't remember,
Yeah.
then that's fine.
Yeah, but I don't
only have
recall. I don't ever recall giving him a diagnosis. But I can look it up or something if you need.
That's fine. Now, you've testified in a few cases, but you've worked on several others. Is that right?
Yeah.
And can you tell us what your hourly rate is for working on these cases?
Yes, it's $200 and I think $10. I think they gave me the extra $10 because I've been practicing it over a decade.
And who gives you that?
The state of North Carolina through the Indigent Defense Fund, I think.
Okay.
Or Indigent Defense Services.
And you've got, well, how many hours do you have in this case? You said you spent 15 hours with the
Yeah,
defendant.
I don't know the total number of hours that I have to bill for this case, but
Over the last about 5 years, does it sound like this would be correct in terms of the ballpark of what you've earned in working on these types of cases, about $57,000?
so about $10,000 a year, yeah, roughly.
Okay. All right.
So less than probably, yeah. So we can see it's not a cash cow.
Now, you said there was a course of treatment for PTSD, and that
Yeah.
it's something that can be treated.
Mhm.
All right. And you reviewed the defendant's medical records at the jail, correct?
Yes.
And he wasn't receiving any sort of medication
Mm-mm.
before you dealt with him. And you came to your conclusion about the fact that he's got PTSD. Did you write him any prescriptions?
I don't have prescription privileges. I'm a psychologist. Yeah.
Did you offer him any sort of therapy?
I am not hired as a clinician in this case.
Are you aware if he's receiving any of it now?
I am not.
All right, thank you, sir.
Yes,
Nothing
sir.
further.
Redirect.
So, Dr. Blackshear, would you expect that, based on your knowledge of corrections, you worked in a prison, right?
Yes, I have.
Would you expect that Mr. Holden's PTSD would be something he'd be receiving medication for in jail?
Potentially. Working in a federal system is quite different than how the state system operates, and especially with the costs associated for the inmate. So, but I do know that most jails and prisons have clinicians and psychiatrists on staff. So, I would expect that it's available.
You mentioned depression. Do you feel that Nate was suffering from depression at the time of this?
Again, depression as kind of a comorbid symptom of a comorbid display of PTSD, perhaps, but I didn't find diagnosing him with major depression to be adequate or suitable for this.
Oh, so more depression as a symptom of the PTSD, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, quite. I mean, it's quite often a reported symptom. Yeah.
Or, well, I guess it's not in the criteria, right? But it's something that might go along with it.
So the criteria is for you to diagnose, but we also have to deal with symptoms. So depression as a mood state is a part of something you may see, but not a person may not be to a level to be clinically diagnosed with having major depressive disorder, which is an entirely different thing from PTSD.
Okay,
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Would fits of crying be a symptom of depression?
Could be.
You talked a lot with Mr. Lively about the fact that your opinion is based on Mr. Holden's self-reporting. And that's correct, right? That you base some of your opinion on what Mr. Holden tells you, right?
I took all of the data that I had available to me to make my clinical decision. So he reported, especially when I read something, I go talk just to get the information. So it's not a person comes to me and say, "Hey, I've had trauma and I can't sleep. I think I have PTSD," and I go, "Oh yeah, you got PTSD." No, it's much more in depth to that, and I have much more professional integrity than that. So this is based on everything that I had available to me, not just his report.
And if someone reported something to you, do you weigh that, or do you use the other sources of information, sort of judging how much weight to give that? Or
Somebody reports something, I need something that corroborates and backs it up.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like you had information in this case that
Yes.
corroborated the things that Nate told you?
The only reason I would offer a diagnosis. Yep.
I mean, does that include all of the information? I mean, he reported to you that there was trauma in his childhood, and you had corroboration of that, right?
Correct.
PTSD is a way of describing the effects of trauma on individuals. Is that fair to say?
It is a after trauma stress syndrome. And so it's what happens to people after they've been through chronic or acute or all the other traumas that were laid out here earlier, and even those that are not in that book that are laid out. It's the change, right? The psychological change that takes place in the individual after they have experienced the traumas. And then that does not mean they don't experience more traumas that also create more change. So it's understood, I mean, that by the way that it's described, post, it means after the trauma experience and the changes that are enduring for the person psychologically and otherwise.
There's a bunch of criteria in the DSM-5 we've heard a lot about. If, say, a hypothetical person were to be missing to meet many, many of those criteria, but they're missing one. They don't have quite enough to meet the diagnostic criteria in the DSM. Would that mean that they have suffered no psychological consequences as the result of trauma?
No. Yeah.
So PTSD is sort of one way of describing the consequences, is
Right.
that right? And people could have lots of psychological reactions to trauma.
Absolutely.
Is the type of trauma that Nate has experienced in his life the type that would result in psychological consequences?
Especially PTSD.
Ms. Hamburger, we're going to recess for the afternoon, resume tomorrow morning unless you are moments away from finishing. Members of the jury, do any of you have any pressing engagements that
She
would
said she's
prevent
close.
that would prevent us
Let me
from
go.
staying? Hold on, sir. That would prevent us from staying for 10 minutes more, perhaps? All right. I apologize in advance, but go ahead. Let's see if we can
Thank
press
you.
on.
So just one more topic is the subject of triggers. I believe from Mr. Lively's questions, you were being asked whether the trigger needs to be identical to the trauma. Is
Right,
that-
and I think I explained that what happened for Nate on that day was not about the screams of a woman who was being abused by her husband or anything like that. That's not how flashbacks or triggers work. A trigger is just something that causes you significant psychological distress.
Okay. And so the triggers on April 9th would have been the situation with the separation is a trigger?
I mean, it could have been, he had reached his point of, that container is full and I can't get connection, I can't get communication, and I'm going to, and I want to see her,
Mm-hmm. And what about the incident between Jeremy and Sylvester? Could that have been a
That
trigger?
incident would not work as a trigger in that moment.
Okay, because it's too remote?
Correct.
But
It would have been, I would say, something that would, if a person gets beyond their capacity and they become harmful to someone else, that's something that comes back to your mind, I'd say. Yeah.
and just to be clear about that, even if there was no gun when during that incident, Nate believed there was a gun, right?
From his report to me, yes.
Could a trigger on April 9th have been Sylvester Taylor approaching Nate Holden before he fired the shots?
Could have been, yeah.
Those are all the questions I have.
Okay.
Any recross?
Sylvester Taylor's threats reported to you by Nathan Holden were not listed as the basis of your opinion for post-traumatic stress disorder. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You may step down.
All right.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we'll recess for the afternoon, resume tomorrow morning at 9:30. Please recall all the instructions I've given you. Don't talk among yourselves or with anyone else about this case. No media or independent investigation regarding these matters. Don't form or express opinions about the outcome. No conversations with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. We will gather at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Please leave your notepads in the chairs. Thank you very much for your service.